Okay, year 11. We're finished the chapter on functions, chapter 3. We're going to look at something from chapter 2 now called absolute value. Okay, now what is absolute value? Well, let's start off with the definition. The absolute value, which is also called the modulus, the absolute value of a number, x, written like this, so a vertical line either side of the x, is the distance from x to 0 on the number line. So here's x. That distance from 0 to x is called the absolute value of x, or the modulus of x. So the best way to understand that is to look at some examples. So we've got to evaluate the following using the number line. So what's the absolute value of 5? So if we go to 5 is here on the number line. Here it is, 5. And what is the distance of 5 from 0? Well, obviously 5 units. So 5. So just remember that absolute value is a distance. What's the absolute value of minus 3? Well, we go to minus 3. Here it is. How far is minus 3 from 0? Well, here's 0. Just there. Okay. So that distance there is 3 units. So the absolute value of minus 3 is 3. What about the absolute value of 9? Well, how far is 9 from 0? Oh, 9 units. Last of all, absolute value of minus 4. Well, minus 4 is here. How far is minus 4 from 0? Well, it's 4 units, isn't it? 1, 2, 3, 4. So the absolute value of minus 4 is 4, because minus 4 is a distance of 4 units from 0. So just think of absolute value as a distance. It's the distance of a number from 0 on the number line. Okay, now something we can get from those questions is the following. The absolute value of a positive number is a positive number. Have a look. Absolute value of 5 is just 5. Now, the absolute value of a negative number is a positive number, isn't it? Have a look. The absolute value of negative 5 is 5. So you can think of absolute value as removing any negative sign. So absolute value of minus 98 equals 98. So that's another way of thinking about absolute value, is taking away any negative sign. Now, as we said, the other word for absolute value is modulus. So if I wrote absolute value of 5, we could also say that is the modulus of 5, right? Or we would just say mod 5. Okay, that's another word we use for absolute value. It still means the same thing, distance of a number from 0. So now we know what absolute value is. Let's try and evaluate these. So what I'd like you to do is to have a go at these questions yourself. All right, so, and you can pause the video if you want and try and work these out, then play the video to see what the answer is. Okay, now for this one, absolute value of negative 4 is 4, plus absolute value of 7 is just 7. 4 plus 7 is just 11. Over here we've got absolute value of 2 is just 2, minus absolute value of negative 5 is just 5. Okay, so it's negative 3 is your answer. And last of all, absolute value of 2 is just 2, subtract. Absolute value of negative 1 is just 1, plus, now this is the absolute value of negative 3 squared. Now the absolute value of negative 3 is just 3, isn't it? So that's 3 squared. Okay, so 2 minus 1 plus 9 gives you 1 plus 9, which equals 10. Okay. All right, let's move on. Now let's look at developing a formal definition for absolute value. Okay, so a formal definition. All right, let's start off by saying if x is equal to 6, I can write down that absolute value of x equals absolute value of 6, which equals 6. Okay. Now, what happens if x equals -6? Well, absolute value of x equals absolute value of -6, which obviously also equals 6. Okay, now, what can we conclude about that? Let's have a look. Well, in the first one we said absolute value of x is equal to 6. Now what's 6 though? 6 is what x was, wasn't it? So I could actually write down this. Absolute value of x is equal to just x, with the proviso stating that that's if x is bigger than 0. Okay, so this is a positive number here. Yep. And over here, right, we've got absolute value of x equals 6, right, which I could write as minus 6. Okay, you might be thinking, why am I doing that? Well, because then that allows me to write this. Now what's minus 6? Well, minus 6 was, or is, what x is. So I could replace the minus 6 with just x. Okay, so that means I can conclude that the absolute value of x is the same as minus x if x is less than 0. Okay. Now, one thing to also consider is what happens if x is equal to 0. Let's change colors for that. Just choose orange for the time being. Okay, so what happens if x equals 0? All right, well, absolute value of x equals absolute value of 0, which also equals 0, doesn't it? So now, what do I know about the 0? Well, that's what x was to begin with, wasn't it? So I could write down, therefore, absolute value of x is equal to x if x equals 0. Because don't forget, that's what x was to start with. Okay? So that means we can write down a formal definition for absolute value. Okay, so let's do that down here. All right. Conclusion. Okay, now, absolute value of x. Now, when does it equal x? It equals x if x is bigger than 0 or if x is equal to 0. So we can write this down. Absolute value of x equals x if x is positive or 0. Now, what's the other thing we learned was absolute value of x equals minus x if x is less than 0. Okay, so that's our formal definition of absolute value. So you could put a little EG after each one if that helps. Absolute value of 7 equals 7. Yeah. So there's your x, isn't it? Right. So, well, this is so absolute value of x is equal to x, right? If x is positive, all right? So what about this one? If I did the second one, absolute value of -7 equals, I could write it as 7, which is just, well, if the -7 is my x, what's the 7? Well, that's just -x, isn't it? Because -7 is just 7. Okay, so there's my formal definition. Okay, now there is one more definition for absolute value which we can write down. So this is our formal definition here. Okay, so here's another definition for absolute value. I'm going to call it modulus, just so I can save a bit of space. Okay, here's another definition. So now let's think of absolute value of -6. What's that equal to? That's just equal to 6, isn't it? Now, starting with -6, how else could I do this? Let's just say I said, all right, -6 all squared. Now that gets rid of the positive, doesn't it? Because I think absolute value gets rid of the positive. So squaring gets rid of the positive. But then I get 36, don't I? I don't want that. So I want to undo the power of 2 that I just added. Now, that's also equal to 6, isn't it? So therefore I can say absolute value of -6 is the same as the square root of -6 squared. Yep, and that means I can say the absolute value of any number is equal to the square root of that number squared. So that here is my alternative definition for absolute value. This is the one we use 99% of the time, but sometimes this becomes useful. Okay. Now, let's just have a look at some properties of that absolute value. And next to each property, I just want to point out, so this property here, here's the example which goes with that property, okay? So have a look. 2 times -3, right, is -6. The absolute value of -6 is just 6. And the absolute value of 2 times the absolute value of -3 is also 6, isn't it? So the way you'd look at that is, if I was going to do the working out for this, I'd go, look, absolute value of 2 times -3 equals the absolute value of -6, which equals to 6. And then obviously absolute value of 2 times the absolute value of -3 is equal to 2 times 3 equals 6. So there's a way of verifying that first example. So next to each of these properties, you've got an example which matches it. So what I'd do if I were you is I'd just work through each example. I'd verify each one of these examples to prove the corresponding property for each example. Okay. All right, now you can now do exercise 203 from the textbook. Okay, 203. All right, that's it.